This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn and I are following up the Writers Book Club episode with a brief chat about framing our stories using bookends like prologues and epilogues around our stories, inspired by Ethan Frome, because Wharton does it so well with that narrative and shift and setting shift. There's a huge chronological jump between the bookends and the main story. So, all right, there we go. I introduced the topic. Kathryn, over to you.
Well, I mean, and you could argue the beautiful part about the fact that she uses it in Ethan Frome is that it is 100% necessary to finish the story, right? It's not just an ending where it's like, ta-da, the end. Like if you didn't have that ending, you wouldn't get the end of the story. And I think that's the most important thing about using a framing device like this is that both pieces, the story does not exist independently of the framing device, right? We need the narrator telling us in the beginning that there is a story to be told. And then we get the story in the middle. And then at the end, we get that conclusion, the climax, the ending with Maddie in the wheelchair. So remembering that the framing devices like prologues and epilogues, they can't just be thrown out, right? You can't just skip it.
Right.
And she does it so beautifully, creating this character who, I mean, almost nothing about the main character in the framing device. Like he just exists. He needs to catch a train. There's very little personal detail. So you can almost picture yourself as that person who's listening to the story, who's getting these details, who is meeting Ethan, which I think is what makes the beginning of it so compelling. And at the end, what gives it that sort of personal hit of tragedy is because you feel like you're the person in there sitting in that house, viewing these women. So it gives that, it's a different distance, right? From the story.
Right. Well, and I think what it illustrates so well is that the prologue and epilogue are distinct from the main story, and they are not decorative. They're essential. So whatever function they fill in your narrative, it's not just because you felt like it or because you thought the genre needs a prologue or an epilogue or something, in the case of Ethan Frome, we would not have a story without this outsider coming to Starkfield and discovering this mystery of what happened to Ethan Frome, and then discovering and delivering the story to us, the body of the story, and then concluding it in that epilogue. Ethan would never tell his own story. Nobody in Starkfield will talk. That's why there is a mystery to be unraveled.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the most successful framing devices, prologue, epilogue, however you want to say that, things that I have seen have all kind of given us that there is a story to be told here feeling. There are some cases like in fantasy and whatnot where they'll have stuff that's completely outside of the main body of the story, but my favorite ones have always been almost like an introduction where you get a lot of times it's that jump into the past, right? Let me tell you about this, and here it is, and you get just enough of the ending in the beginning to know what you're leading up to, but you just don't know how they got there.
Right.
And that's the intrigue, and that's what pulls you into the story. And then at the end, you need that resolution of, again, we've jumped forward in time now. There's a Kristen Hanna book that I can't remember off the top of my brain, but I'll put it in the show notes, guys, I promise, about World War II in France. And this woman in the beginning, you get this old woman who's being summoned to speak because of the things that happened during World War II and the people that she saved, right? And then in the end, you get her showing up at the speaking engagement. And there's a twist because beautiful writing does that. But again, it's like that you get that, something happened. She saved people, but how did that happen? And then you jump back and you get the whole center of the novel is just that narrative through World War II, right? She's not necessarily like going back and forth. We just get that straight narrative, just like in Ethan Frome. We're in Ethan's perspective. We are in her perspective in the past. And, there's a couple other ones that I can think of that do kind of a similar thing where the narrator tells us, guess what? This happened. And now I'm going to show you how it happened. And that is that pull into the center of the story.
Yes. Yeah. And in both of these examples, and also in the way I handled prologue and epilogue in my own writing, there's a major narrative shift. So it's not just like chapter 1 is 1990 and chapter 2 is 2020 or something like that. Right. It's not just a jump in time. There is a significant shift to the narrative, which is what makes it a true framing device, and not just like, oh, I need you to know this thing that's outside the main narrative. You might have a prologue in which you show something like the traumatic event in your protagonist's childhood, but that child isn't the protagonist. We need to jump ahead 20 or 30 years, right? So that's a true prologue. It's outside the body of the main story, but it isn't a framing device the way we're talking about in Ethan Frome and in that World War II story you're describing.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. So we're saying so far that in a true framing device, your prologue and epilogue have significant jumps in time, a major narrative shift, a twist. You mentioned about the World War II book, and we certainly get a twist in the epilogue of Ethan Frome. So I think
it's like you think what's going to happen because of the body of the story, but the ending does subvert expectations for sure.
Yes. Yeah. A surprise so powerful in Ethan Frome that I have not been able to remember it. I'm like, block it out. No. Spare Maddie.
Right. You're like, I don't want this to be as tragic as it is, so I'm just going to forget about it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I would argue that probably is part of it, for sure. Yeah, that your ending doesn't really happen until the epilogue portion of that framing device. That is part of the ending there.
Right.
I don't know if you would say it's the climax.
No,
but it's definitely the resolution of the climax does not occur until the ending.
Right. And it's not an epilogue like 5 years later, this is where our characters were. It is essential to understanding the main story, right? Like in all those examples, Ethan Frome, the World War II book, and the time I've used it in my own writing, the reader would be cheating herself if she skipped the epilogue, because it's not just I'm depriving you of imagining the character's future by telling you what happened, like in the epilogue at the end of the Harry Potter series, where we see them all married and with children. It's something that further shapes your understanding of the main story.
I almost feel like it's the beginning is let me tell you this story, and the ending is this is why I told you this story. Right. And if you don't have both, then the story in the middle, it loses meaning. Right. So.
Right.
Yeah. Without Starkfield gives people too many winters, or he's been too many winters in Starkfield. What is Ethan Frome? It's just a story about a man who gets in an accident. You have to have the thematic quality, which I think the framing device is what provides that, the theme of the story and the why we care.
Yeah. Very true. Interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said and applying it to my own story, Saving Annabelle, and thinking, can I say that about my framing device as well? And I think I can. I mean, it's a novel, not a novella. It's a long novel. So does it define the theme? Actually, I think it certainly addresses the central question raised by the narrative.
Yeah.
And yeah, a reader would be missing a lot of the meaning of the story and a lot of my intention behind the story if the reader skipped or if I failed to write the framing of this piece. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Kristen Hanna book is also very, very long. It's called The Nightingale.
Okay.
Kristen Hanna book. And again, it's also very long. And so you almost, by the end, you almost have forgotten that this frame exists and that you're going to get the end of it, but it's so satisfying when you get back to it. Right. And so I think that's, yeah, what stories demand that. You got to figure that out, when you need that extra oomph, right?
Right.
Of the time jump, of the making meaning out of the story that you told.
Yeah. And would you lose the theme or some essential part of the theme if you didn't have the framing in the Nightingale?
Yes. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Because it changes your relationship with the book. The twist at the end changes the way that you view the whole story.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that's so true. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is the defining trait of the frame as opposed to just a prologue or just an epilogue, but using the framing device.
Yeah.
Wow, I feel like we've just solved the problems of the writer's world. You're welcome.
Well, yeah, maybe.
Go forth and write framing devices.
Not every book needs a framing device, though, either. Don't jump down the rabbit hole of immediately trying to frame your novel. Oh, maybe do. Try. But not every book demands it. So, when would you say that you should use a device like this?
When it's essential, when the story demands it of you. That's one of those questions we get. And if someone asks me a question like that, my question back is always, well, what are you writing? Tell me about the story. And then let's explore whether or not this possibility makes sense. Is this, in the case of a prologue or opening outside of the main narrative, why do you need to do that? What is lost if you don't do that? What is gained if you do that? And for me, with Saving Annabelle, I have a different narrator in the framing device, which is essential to understanding the end of the story, which is essential to your relationship to the protagonist through the climax. It really, yeah. Sorry, guys, I'm not gonna spoil it, but I'm just using it as an example of these are the questions you need to ask yourself as a writer that will determine for you whether it's a yes or a no. And you might write a beautiful frame, you might have a brilliant idea, but I've seen this in my coaching groups where a writer has some brilliant idea, but then can't make it work because it's not fitting with the main narrative. So sometimes those beautiful ideas have to be shelved and fit to a different work. Maybe they belong to a different story.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that for me, when I read these, the reason that they need the framing device is because you need the distance. I think you read the story itself and the immediacy of it loses the thematic punch, and you need the narrative distance of the beginning and the ending to give you why it matters. And in The Nightingale, this is very obvious because she's got I don't remember how many years, between 60 years or something, right? Where she's looked back on it and she's been able to reconcile what happened, because the events of the story are, it's World War II in France. They're horrifying, right? But, and if you just ended the story at the end of the war, she hasn't changed enough yet. She hasn't lived enough life in between for the theme and for it to matter. So you need that looking back. Another book that I have the author, but not the name of, and I will put in the show notes. It's a Garth Stein book. Anyway, the narrator, again, he goes back in time because he needs that distance from the house and the family in order to reveal the meaning. So it's like 40 years later, and he's brought his kids back because he needed that distance in order to realize what it meant to him. So I think if you look at your story and you say thematically, I need distance from the events in the story in order to make meaning, then you may need a framing device. You may need a way for the reader to back up and look at the whole picture. And you can't necessarily do that if you just stick so tightly to your POV and you don't have a distance in your narrator, right? So you could have a narrator that has distance, or you might use a framing device to give that narrator distance once they've finished the story.
Right. Well, and I think key to the framing device is also that it opens up opportunities for understanding for the reader that wouldn't exist without it. So you would still have your main narrative, and you would still have themes, and you would still have plot and character, but we would not be able to see it with as much nuance, insight, perspective, meaning, whatever, without the framing device, without that major shift in narrative, whether it's chronological or a change in narrator, or like in Ethan Frome, it's the same narrator telling the story, but in the frame, he's telling it in a first person as the narrator has just lived these events. But in the main narrative, he steps back into an authorial third invisible narrator, right? So we get Ethan's point of view exclusively because the narrator has left the I and become authorial, which is a huge shift between the frame and the main story.
Yeah. And you get his distance also in the fact that he's a stranger, right? Because it would have been seen completely differently by someone who lived in the town their whole life versus from a stranger on the outside. So, yeah.
Right. Cool. We understand so framing devices now. I know.
Right? That you say, oh, look, cool, a frame. But when you really start digging into it, it's like, oh, cool, a frame, and what that does to the story. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Wow.
Get excited
I'm so
with us, people.
happy because we've just geeked out about framing devices, literary framing devices.
Exactly. And if you haven't already, read Ethan Frome for a masterclass in framing devices. There you go.
Yes. Amen. And all right. So next episode, we are discussing Junot Diaz's short story, Fiesta 1980, and we will be joined by Dave, one of our listeners and fellow writer, friend of the show. So make sure you pick up Fiesta 1980 and read along and join us at the roundtable. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.